Hello, my name's Joe Smith. I'm Director at the Royal Geographical Society, and welcome back to our Monday night lecture Greatest Hits series. Throughout the summer we're replaying one of our previous lectures and giving you another chance to engage with it and to bring comments or questions to the speaker. Just use the Slido tool at the bottom of your screen at any point in the lecture and for 15 minutes afterwards. So now to introduce tonight's speakers. Professor David Vaughan is the Director of Science with responsibility for the strategic development and excellence in scientific output of the science teams employed by the British Antarctic Survey. He's also been a lead on EU projects and an IPCC lead author. David now chairs the British Antarctic Survey Science Strategy Team and is a member of the NERC Science Board. Camilla Nichol is the Chief Executive of the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, a charity which conserves 6 sites on the Antarctic Peninsula and works to promote the Antarctic heritage here in the UK. Camilla has had a varied 25-year museum career working for organisations with collections as diverse as geology, science and medical instruments, anatomy and pathology, and also the early oil industry. At UK AHT, she's responsible for a major heritage conservation programme on the Antarctic Peninsula and for telling the extraordinary story of human endeavour in Antarctica since it was first discovered in 1820. Jane Rumble OBE has enjoyed a long career as a civil servant. She joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to work on polar policy in 2003 and became the head of the Polar Regions Department in 2007. She leads the UK's policy and science delegations to the annual meetings of the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Parties and the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. These are meetings involving over 50 countries, inherently complex, politically sensitive and commercially significant. David, Jane and Camilla's lecture considers Antarctica's history and its unique status as a continent reserved for peace and science. Welcome back all of you, and as I say to the audience again, you can post your questions and comments at any point throughout the lecture. Welcome.
Well, good evening, and Joe, thank you very much for the kind collective introductions. I won't take up too much of the valuable time except to say I'm really delighted to chair this event. Just so the audience knows what to expect, our 3 distinguished speakers will each speak for around 15 minutes. I'll try and keep them to time, purely because we should then have about half an hour for question and answer, and hopefully a roving microphone or 2 might go around, and I'll try and pick out as many people as I can. Be warned, if you don't ask any questions, I will ask questions on your behalf, and that's truly terrifying because I'll have to think of a few. But just to answer very quickly, the most important anniversary coming up is, of course, the 60th anniversary of the Antarctic Treaty on the 1st of December of this year. And Jane probably will say more about that. But first, let me introduce Camilla, who will open proceedings. Camilla, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here. So I've got 15 minutes, thank you, Klaus, to give you a whistle-stop tour history of Antarctica. So I'm going to give you the first 150 years. So to give you an idea of where we've come from and how we've got to where we are. So our relationship with Antarctica is a recent one. Yet we now know how significant Antarctica is in our global system and as the last discovered wilderness on Earth. The ancient Greeks were the first to think about Antarctica. They reasoned that there should be a southern landmass in opposition to the Antarctic. But it wasn't until the 18th century and Captain Cook when we have a record of humans coming close to discovering this hitherto mythical place. Cook famously circumnavigated Antarctica in the 1770s without ever sighting it. He crossed the Antarctic Circle 3 times before returning to warmer latitudes and getting on with other things. However, Cook's observations of plentiful seals and whales and wildlife in these southern waters prompted a race to exploit these natural riches. And exploit they did. The outlying islands of Antarctica were plundered for their fur and later whale oil, and as these hunters became more ambitious, the further south they pushed. It did take another 50 years, however, before Antarctica as we know it was reached and first sighted. I only have two portraits here because two portraits of two of the first discoverers don't exist. But in quick succession, in 1819 and in 1820, first William Smith in 1819 discovered the South Shetland Islands. And then in 1820, in January, Fabian von Bellinghausen and Edward Bransfield both sighted different parts of Antarctica within 3 days of one another. And then later that year, Nathaniel B. Palmer, an American sealer, reached another part of Antarctica and described and mapped it. So they all reached and observed the islands and continent of Antarctica, thus opening up a whole portion of the planet as yet unknown, uncharted, and unexploited. And so 200 years ago, our relationship with Antarctica began. The sighting of Antarctica caused great excitement, of course. Once sighted, sailors, sealers, and navigators of many nationalities clamoured to chart, name, and land upon and harvest the natural resources of Antarctica. Some with rather more style than others. Slowly, the maps were inked in, and as they charted the coastline, and by 1840, Antarctica was declared a continent. But as yet, the interior had not been penetrated, and there seemed to be little interest in doing so at that time, in the 19th century. Maybe perhaps an awareness of there being little in the way of commercial interest, perhaps. The majority of the expeditions, bar that of Cook really, were commercial expeditions. They were sealing and whaling, and they're prospecting particularly for seal fur. And at its peak, the annual summer catch was 120,000 seals, which is devastating. Inevitably, this was unsustainable, and by the 1830s, the first seals were all but wiped out in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. And by the 1840s and 1850s, interest in Antarctica declined because the commercial interest had just disappeared. It took another 40 years before our interest in Antarctica was reignited. And we come to these halls in 1893, in these very halls, and a lecture by John Murray entitled The Renewal of Antarctic Exploration. And he was a call to arms. He had a focus on research and exploration for the sake of knowledge and understanding, and he urged a return to the Antarctic to resolve the outstanding geographical questions still posed in the South. This marked an international renewal of interest in Antarctica and triggered the heroic era, perhaps the most famous era of Antarctic exploration. And it pushed through into the 20th century. Again, this ignited international interest. Several nations launched expeditions once again to the area. This time, whilst there was still a commercial thrust, as whalers increased their activity once again, this was the moment that scientific and geographical discovery became the drivers. These expeditions were both publicly and privately funded, and as they were expeditions these were the expeditions whose stories have endured through the decades. Explorers' huts were established at strategic locations, and some still survive today, and the quest to conquer the continent commenced, reaching geographical and magnetic poles, continental crossing, and the summiting mountains were all attempted to varying success. What was notable, however, in this era was the amount of scientific data that was now being collected, and the specimens and the data that was being recorded and brought back. However, alongside the heroic activities of Amundsen, Scott, Shackleton, and their ilk, Antarctic whaling experienced a resurgence, a shift away from the small ship-based whaling to more industrialized models. Vast whaling stations were established in South Georgia, and large factory ships, whaling ships, which processed whales on board, were increasingly seen in Antarctic waters, particularly memorably at Deception Island and Port Lockroy. Today, many beaches still bear the remains of this industry today. In the 1920s, a decline in whale populations was being experienced by these whalers, and it was becoming obvious. Species by species, populations were being decimated, and it was described as being more like mining than fishing, and was certainly wholly unsustainable. The UK, wishing to sustain that valuable whaling tax income, realised that this could not continue, and that whaling needed to be put on a much more sustainable footing. So the UK initiated the Discovery Investigations, a programme of research, of oceanographic research, which aimed to perpetuate and regulate the whaling industry and put it on a sustainable footing. Ultimately, however, whilst great science was indeed carried out and great data collected, it was too late for the whales. By the early 1930s, there were so few whales left that the industry came to a halt, with several species becoming almost extinct. Meanwhile, technology was advancing at a massive rate, and the introduction of mechanised models of transport in Antarctica began. Australians and Americans, particularly, boldly pioneered Antarctic flights, and this was to transform Antarctic exploration. Suddenly, aerial photography and surveying enabled views of the continent never before seen, and expeditions that could reach much farther as a result. The map was truly now being filled in apace, and our understanding of Antarctica was increasing rapidly. But alongside all these triumphs of human accomplishment and scientific discovery, there was, of course, a political storm brewing. The first few decades of the 20th century also saw much in the way of political manoeuvring in Antarctica. There has always been a political dimension to human activity in the Antarctic. The early explorers, including Cook, of course, were claiming lands they cited for king and country, but this really came to the fore in the 20th century, with the UK leading the charge. Without an indigenous population and no prospect of one, and no automatic territorial claims as we perhaps see in the Arctic, Antarctica was fair game for a sovereignty race. In 1908, Britain extended its territory in the South Atlantic by declaring sovereignty over South Georgia, the South Orkney Islands, South Shetland Islands, and the Antarctic Peninsula. Banish all thoughts, perhaps, of this being a romantic extension of the British Empire. This is mostly about money and taxation of the whaling industry. Commercial whalers were causing a problem. They were now using these factory ships, and they could now catch and process whales at sea, outside territorial waters, and therefore be exempt from taxation. And this was not on, and it was a loophole waiting and needing to be closed. The UK had designs on claiming the whole continent, of course, and the British government claimed more portions of the continent and apportioned them to New Zealand and Australia, at that time still under British governance. France and Norway, however, were not having it and put forward their own claims, to which the UK eventually assented. And Norway, particularly as a whaling superpower, were eager to continue to enjoy the riches of the Southern Ocean. There was even an abortive attempt by Germany in the Second World War to claim a large area, but this was thwarted after the war ended. Just as significant, perhaps, were the competing claims by Chile and Argentina. They were both watching this sovereignty arms race, if you like, with indignation and moved to assert their own claims to the Antarctic Peninsula region in 1940 and 1943, respectively. These bold moves from these proximal South American countries, as well as the German effort, provoked the UK into action. Britain needed to visibly assert her claim to the Antarctic territory, and so Operation Tabarin was launched. This was a secret wartime operation in 1943, and it was to establish permanently occupied wintering bases in Antarctica to strengthen the British claim. The cover story was that it was to monitor shipping activity during the war in the Southern Ocean and to deter German U-boats. But the real purpose, of course, was to counter particularly Argentina's encroachment in British Antarctic territory. In 1944, two bases, A and B, were established at Port Lockroy and Whalers Bay, respectively, and a third, Base D, in Hope Bay on the other side of the peninsula. The expedition was led by Antarctic veteran Lieutenant James Marr, previously seen on the Discovery Investigations and as a Boy Scout on Shackleton's last expedition. And he took with him educated men who were scientists and excellent sailors who could keep themselves occupied with scientific endeavours during the long season and the winter months. The first winterers at Port Lockroy built the base in a few weeks and set to work with the geological, meteorological and biological studies, spending 2 years on base, and that was the first team that were there. And the establishment of Port Lockroy and the Operation Tabarin really marked the start of British state-funded scientific programmes in Antarctica, and it was to become the birthplace of the British Antarctic Survey. At the end of the war, Operation Tabarin was disbanded, but the Antarctic programme continued. It was still important that we asserted that claim and started and continued with the science. And it was renamed the Falkland Islands Dependencies Survey. It was a programme which was to grow quickly and spread south down the Antarctic Peninsula over the next few years. The 1940s and 50s marked a very important period in Antarctica. The rapid development of science programs internationally and scientific expeditions from a number of nations. The USA took a major interest. Argentina and Chile established several small bases, often within sight of British ones. Clearly, there's still a sovereignty element to all of this. By the late 1950s, there were 13 British bases and 3 refuges, all in active operation, the largest at any one time. But the late 50s were incredibly important. In 1957-58, it was the International Geophysical Year. 17 months, long year, of international scientific collaboration, focused largely, but not exclusively, on the Antarctic. 67 countries participated in this ambitious programme, and 12 of which were operating a network of scientific stations, undertaking a whole range of scientific studies. Stations such as Halley Bay, the South Pole Station, Vostok, Scott Base, and several more, still in use today, were established during this time. This really was a period of intense scientific activity with a powerful scientific legacy. But moreover, it demonstrated an international will and ability to collaborate and set aside territorial differences. The long but positive shadow it cast, of course, was to pave the way for the Antarctic Treaty. And I'll let Jane continue from there. Thank you very much.
And thank you for your exquisite timing as well. So our next speaker, as Camilla hinted, is Jane Rumble to take us a little bit further in the story. Jane.
Thank you. I'm just going to get some water. Excellent. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. It's lovely to see it's so packed here. As preluded, I'm going to pick it up at this time. Now, you will have seen this map before. I want you to be thinking mild peril in diplomatic terms. So this is a scenario of the competing claims in the peninsula, as Camilla has mentioned. The UK having made the first claim in 1908, subsequently, during the Second World War, well, actually before that, Australia and New Zealand kind of forced by the UK. The reason that France has a bit between the Australian claims is because the UK was a bit gung-ho, and then somebody mentioned that actually France had been there. de Montdeville actually went to that part of France in 1840, so that's why it's split. And then Argentina and Chile both made claims based on a sort of prolongation of South America. So there were the competition between the overlapping claims around the peninsula. But added to that, this was also in the 1950s, the time of the Cold War. So we also had the United States and the USSR who didn't really want to make territorial claims, but reserved the right to claim the entire continent at a moment of their choosing, because clearly they were the superpowers, and so it should probably belong to one of those. Now, the Americans, with their nice flying machine, had got to the South Pole, the first people to land on the South Pole, and had set up a base there. So when they go for a walk, they go into everybody's pie slice, just to prove that it doesn't belong to anyone else. The Russians, or the USSR, I should say, put a base in everybody's pie slice. So this got to the geophysical year in the late 1950s, and scientists are notoriously poor at respecting political tension. So they just went marching into Antarctica in order to look at it and work out what was going on. And of course, they established bases. And so at the end of the geophysical year, there was a discussion, particularly around, there was a Russian base in the Australian claim sector, and there were some exchanges between the Commonwealth countries going, do you think they'll leave? Probably not. What are we going to do about it? And so these increasing tensions were noted by our American friends, who invited everybody to Washington to discuss the state of Antarctica, because the key policy, really, the principle was to ensure that it maintained peace and enabled it to be useful for science, since the scientists had actually determined this place was quite important. We'd only discovered it 150 years ago. We were beginning to learn that actually it drives the ocean, it drives the atmosphere, so we need to facilitate science. So, eventually, by the late 1950s, there was a discussion in Washington in order to look at the treaty. I am at this point, however, going to do a shameless plug for the www.discoveringantarctica.org.uk, which is where this map comes from, which is the Royal Geographical Society educational website on Antarctica, sponsored by the Foreign Office and the British Antarctic Survey. So if you're a geography teacher, that's where you need to go. End of advert. So we get to the Antarctic Treaty. This was signed in 1959, so as is preluded, it will have its 60th birthday on the 1st of December. The 12 countries who originally participated, you will recall from Camilla's slide, were the ones who were most active in Antarctica, particularly during the geophysical year, but actually most of them had also been involved in Antarctic exploration prior to that. So it came into force in 1961, pretty quick. The UK was the first to sign it, obviously. But everybody had signed it within 2 years. It was a very short, or it is a very short instrument, though. It only actually has 14 articles, which for an international agreement is incredibly short. And it was very simple in its scope. So it had to deal with the territorial issues. So it did that by basically putting them in abeyance, which means that you can't deny their existence, which protects the position of the claimants. However, you also cannot extend your claim or do anything that kind of tries to enforce your claim against someone else, so that protects the position of those who don't actually recognise anybody's right to a claim. So it sort of puts it on ice, pun intended. The second issue that it had to deal with was nuclear testing and dumping, because believe it or not, there were some people that thought that maybe Antarctica was a good place to go and dump waste, since nobody lived there, so why bother? It demilitarized the continent because a lot of the early expeditions, which you will have seen, were actually military. So there was a concern about kind of building up military garrisons and so on. So the idea was to get rid of that and instead try to maintain it for peace and science and sort of set aside the differences. And it's actually been incredibly successful, and it's not one of those moribund treaties that kind of comes and goes. It is still relevant. It's still going 60 years later. The most recent country to sign it was Slovenia, just in April of this year. We had Iceland, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia in 2015. So it's not like we're not getting new parties. However, of course, since it only really covered the basics of stop squabbling and let's kind of work constructively on this continent, it didn't really address any of the issues around Antarctica. At this time, we'd killed most of the whales, sadly, but there was a concern that sealing would come back because there was some recovery in the seal stocks. And so one of the first sort of additional conventions that was agreed under the auspices of the treaty was the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Seals. It's in my slide in brackets because thankfully nobody actually went back to Antarctica to continue sealing, but if you want to, there is a convention. However, the later ones would stop you doing that. So this was in the 1970s. In the 1980s, we were still in extraction mode as a sort of global community. So the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, which I will mention, is still active. That's basically the part of the treaty that does fish, essentially. It's supposed to do conservation of Antarctic marine living resources. Effectively, it means managing fish. And then at the end of the 1980s, there was actually a negotiation to look at minerals and to work out how the world would divvy up the minerals of Antarctica. But the world changed in the late 1980s. This was the time of a sort of environmental revolution. And so that never came into force. And actually not bringing it into force created a bit of an international crisis, into which there was a concern about what to do. So the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty in 1991 is one of the fastest comprehensive environmental protection agreements ever agreed, because we'd basically spent all of this time agreeing that you could go to Antarctica and take the minerals, to which everyone was like, yay, there's minerals in Antarctica, and there are, to then like, well, there's no law. So it had to be, the vacuum had to be filled very quickly, and so the Protocol of Environmental Protection basically filled that gap. I'm stuck. There we go. So just briefly to give you a bit more detail about these. So the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or Camilla, as we affectionately call it. As I say, this is the bit that basically talks about fish. So its objective is to conserve, but the definition of conservation is that it includes rational use. And there's a great debate about this now, about how do you get conservation whilst also fishing? Should you balance those two things, or should you be focused on conservation? But it's not a regional fisheries management organisation, or an RFMO, for those of you in the parlance. I get Tourette's if people say this. It's not an RFMO. Because it's based on the ecosystem approach. It's part of the treaty. So the conservation doesn't just look at the fish stocks, it looks at all animals in Antarctica. So krill is the tiny little shrimp-like creature that everything feeds on. So you can't fish that because it'll affect the penguins, it'll affect the whales, it'll affect the bigger predatory species. So Antarctica Camilla tries to look at the entire system. At the time that this was agreed, we still had the Soviet nation, and the Soviets were flooding the Antarctic Southern Ocean with their fishing fleet. So there are some stocks that are actually still not back. The mackerel rock cod, for example, has not yet recovered from overfishing, but the stocks that are now managed on a very precautionary basis. So that's Camilla. So then the protocol that I mentioned, this was basically agreed in the 1990s. So again, it's a different mindset. So it's no longer using Antarctica or kind of using the resources of Antarctica. We're now into protecting Antarctica. So the protocol actually basically designates Antarctica as a reserve for peace, as a natural reserve for peace and science. So the main things that it does, the one thing that you're probably most heard of is that there is a prohibition on the commercial exploitation of minerals in Antarctica. And this is where that comes from, the environmental protocol. It also says that if you want to go to Antarctica, you need to plan what you're going to do there, and you need to conduct an environmental impact assessment, and you need to mitigate your environmental footprint, basically. This is actually quite an active agreement. Switzerland and Turkey joined in 2017. They're the newest partners. And this is reflecting the fact that Antarctica is becoming more accessible, so more people are going there. And this is the instrument that basically says to the UK, you must control British nationals and what they get up to in Antarctica. And if they do something wrong, then you, UK, need to sort it out. So we implement this into UK domestic legislation. So if you want to go to Antarctica and you're not going with a tour operator that has permission from someone else, then you need to persuade the Foreign Office that it's a good idea. So in terms of what does all this mean? Well, the successes of the treaty, and we would argue that it is one of the most successful international agreements, is that for 60 years it has done what it said on the tin, which was to keep Antarctica peaceful and to encourage international scientific cooperation. So Antarctica is the only continent in the world that hasn't seen conflict, and long may that be the case. I won't say too much about science because I will be eating David's chips, so to speak, but clearly there's been a lot of science development in Antarctica. The mineral prohibition that I've mentioned is probably what it's most famous for. So you cannot go to Antarctica and extract any kind of mineral for commercial purposes. That includes hydrocarbons, i.e. oil and gas. In 2016, we designated the world's largest marine protected area. That's the Ross Sea, which is 1.55 million kilometres squared. There's also another smaller marine protected area near the South Orkney Islands. And again, these are complex international negotiations coming back to this question of the right to fish, effectively. But the two main there are three main activities in Antarctica. There's science, and then the two main commercial activities are tourism and fishing. So that's the successes and where we are now. I thought I'd mention a little bit about the challenges. Possibly, yeah, there we go. So one of the main challenges of Antarctica, which again David's going to talk to, is that it is changing. Undeniably, it's changing, and at quite a rapid rate. Which means there are more ice-free areas, but also technology is changing. So whereas, going back 100 years, you would need to go to Antarctica on a wooden ship, you can now fly in a commercial 767, if you want to, right into the interior of Antarctica. So the accessibility of the place is moving on, and we need to be keeping pace with that, basically, and predicting what might happen and making sure that we've got structures in place to look after that. Tourism is particularly on the up, and I've used this graph from the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, partly so you can see the changing, if you can read it from the back, the changing demographic. So the Americans have always been way out in front in terms of numbers of people going to Antarctica. The UK was for a while second until about 2008 with the economic downturn. We're coming up a little bit. But you may notice that China start at the bottom on the left-hand side and are now second. So the changing demographic of people going to Antarctica, but also the volume. We've gone from about 10,000 a year to roughly around 50,000. Projections are in the next 3 years we'll get to about 100,000. There are 28 new build expedition ships being built right now. So managing that, and what does that mean as a experience of going to Antarctica? People want to go there for the wilderness experience or to be in a pristine environment. Well, if you turn up and there's 200 of your best friends already on the site, that maybe isn't going to deliver you what you might have originally gone for. So managing tourism is a big conversation at the moment. And then I've alluded to it a couple of times, but this question of conservation and protection and what that actually means when you've got one convention that talks about fishing, and the conversation there is whether you need to balance conservation and rational use, i.e., should you have a marine protected area if it doesn't allow fishing? Is that balance? That's the view of some of our international colleagues. In the same way they look at tourism. Should you use Antarctica? Should you balance conservation and use? And then you compare that to what the protocol says, which is much more talking about protection, and basically making sure that we hand over Antarctica to the next generation in a way that we found it for our generation. So there are many challenges in terms of fisheries, and there is an abundance of fish in the Southern Ocean. There are thankfully only about 50 ships that fish outside of areas of national jurisdiction in the entire Southern Ocean. This is a seventh of the planet, basically. If you went to a typical port somewhere in Europe, you would see more than 50 ships just hauled up. So the fishing footprint is pretty low, and it's precautionary and sustainable right now, but is that going to continue to be the case? And also with climate change, we're talking about species who are already living at the extremity of their existence. There is nowhere colder to go once the polar regions start warming, so stress is on the system. And then there are some other discussions. For example, we often read in the paper the enthusiasm to go to Antarctica and bring back an iceberg, because that's going to solve all your water issues. Discuss. There are also enthusiasm to go what we call biologically prospecting, which is to go and find interesting genetics which may then have a commercial use. So when you eat ice cream, if you're old as me, you used to get an ice cream and it had little ice crystals in it. Now you get super smooth, creamy ice cream, and the gene that prevents you from getting ice crystals in your ice cream is from Antarctic pondweed. So you can think of that next time you're tucking into Ben & Jerry's. So there is a commercial use of some of these genes which are completely unique because of the living in such an extreme environment. The other challenge we have is that there is a global myth that the prohibition on minerals will expire. If you ever read anything about the minerals prohibition in Antarctica expiring, it is not true. However, many countries will use this as there is a change in the way that you can renegotiate the protocol 50 years after it came into force. So there's this date of 2048 that people will mention. However, you cannot get rid of the minerals prohibition unless you have a regime in place that governs mineral exploitation. And for that regime to exist, you would have to have consensus. So it is true that tomorrow we could all wake up and decide, we need to go to Antarctica because I need lithium or whatever it is in my batteries, or I need that rare earth, so let's just do it. However, that would require consensus amongst the treaty parties. So there is no expiration of the treaty. But the question is, for how much longer are we willing to keep Antarctica pristine, and how much longer are we willing to preserve it? To answer any of these questions, of course, however, the main thing is that we need to know the science. So in a neat segue, and I've stuck a picture of a penguin in here because David's going to tell you about complicated things and not wildlife, and if you've come to an Antarctic lecture, you probably want a picture of a penguin. So I'm going to hand over to David. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, as well, for keeping beautifully to time. David, just in case you do want to avail yourself, be my guest. So it's a great pleasure to have our final speaker in the trio, David Vaughan, bringing us up to speed on Antarctic science. David.
Thank you very much, Klaus. And I apologise to anybody who was expecting to see Professor Jane Francis here tonight. I'm afraid you're going to have to make do with the monkey rather than the organ grinder. But it's always worth remembering that actually the organ grinder just turns the handle. It's the monkey that does the little dance. So, thank you very much. British Antarctic Survey is part of a new restructured landscape of UK science, and I wanted to show you the new branding for UKRI and the 9 research councils within it. BAS is still part of those research councils and is there to advise UK government on Antarctic issues and to lead science where we can. We operate for the UK, 4 stations in Antarctica and the sub-Antarctic islands. We still, well, actually we're waiting for 1 ship to be delivered at the moment. Then we'll be back up to having 2 ships, 5 aircraft. And we're just beginning the the Antarctic season at the moment, when around 100 UK scientists will be going to the Antarctic to conduct research. Tonight, I'm going to take you through my extremely subjective personal choice about some scientific advances that have gone on within Antarctica. Largely what we're talking about is human impacts, human footprints, if you like, on the Antarctic continent. And we're going to be going through using my timeline, which has taken me forever, my wife will tell you, to put together in PowerPoint. And we start with that historic date, 1819, and I'm going to show you some of the key footprints that humankind has put onto the Antarctic continent. The first surprise is actually, before we actually started to explore Antarctica, we were already making a footprint on it. 1775. We're all used to seeing, I hope, the Antarctic ice cores, the bubbles in Antarctic ice that have that sample of previous atmospheric composition, the ice that contains a history of the temperature of the water as it fell, and that have produced these kind of records of climate change and the change in greenhouse gases that drove that climate change. If we look back at a particular time, 1775, we can see there was already a big change going on in Antarctica. We are arguing that that's the change between the Holocene, the natural period since the last glaciation, and the time when humans became the pervasive force on the planet and changed even areas like Antarctica. This graph shows the composition, a compilation of data from a number of ice cores at 1775 or thereabouts. That's when carbon dioxide started to rise in the ice cores. Not only did carbon dioxide start to rise in concentration, but the isotopes in that carbon changed. Again, 1775. Why? Because an increasing amount of carbon-13 was coming out of fossil fuels as they were being burnt. Of course, what was happening? Well, actually, Newcomen's steam engine had been kicking off the Industrial Revolution in the UK. Prior to that, the burning of coal had increased no end. Around 1775, it really kicked off as James Watt improved that Newcomen steam engine, and steam became an effective source of funding, of powering the Industrial Revolution. That was even before we first spotted Antarctic. The snow in Antarctica had that record of our change. So to sweep through, we're going to go past the William Smith discoveries, 1819, go to 1910. The heroic era has already been mentioned. I actually think of this as the kind of the miserable era of Antarctic exploration, a period when all men, went to the Antarctic and did heroic and desperate things to plant flags. Some science was done, but largely it was about exploration. By the time we moved forward again to the 1940s, we had Operation Tabarin, and people had cheered up in the Antarctic no end. There were some smiles around, and I like to think of this as truly the beginning of Antarctic science in the sense of its modern sense. Back to the timeline, moving forward just a bit, and we get to the IGY. As has been said, the first real geophysical stations were built in Antarctica by a variety of countries. This was our first station at Halley. We'll talk a little bit more about Halley Station in a minute, but this was Halley 1, and I'm going to be telling you a bit more about Halley 6 in due course. These stations were actually extremely important, and they, beyond any other, taught us more about, ironically, the interaction between the Earth and the Sun, and the way that the ejections from the coronal mass ejections from the Sun impacts the Earth, and still threatens today our satellite constellations around the planet. Moving on a little bit further, 1985, big thing that happened here was David Vaughan joined British Antarctic Survey, given a woolly shirt and a woolly jumper, and I can still remember how much those itched, and sent to the Antarctic. Actually, I never really got close to the theodolite. I had to write the numbers down from the chap that actually knew how to use the theodolite. Things have changed. Actually, what really was happening in Antarctica at that time was that the discovery of the ozone hole, this motley crew from the British Antarctic Survey, who'd been measuring ozone since the IGY, showed that as a result of the emissions of CSCs from refrigerants and aerosols, even as far as Antarctica, the ozone was being depleted. Of course, this is a good news story. The Montreal Protocol was signed before that decade was out, and that was the protocol that's reduced the emissions of those gases that erode the ozone layer. But that fingerprint is still there in the ozone. As you can see, coming up to the present day, the ozone minimum is still low. We also started to see that actually the Antarctic continent was changing, and the floating ice shelves around Antarctica, and these are the very first Landsat images that we saw, the change of Wordie ice shelf, an area around the size of Norfolk, was retreating between 1974 and 1988, and the ice was collapsing in a way that was really pretty dramatic. When we thought that that ice sheet was the sleeping giant, the big thing in the planet that was so hard to move and would be so unchangeable. Remember, at this time, late 1980s, early 1990s, climate change was really just a niche interest and something that very few people had talked about. Move forward just a little bit, and this is one of my favourite things, which came really out of nowhere. The first satellites to measure change in the volume of the Antarctic ice sheet. I've shown in the smaller diagram the modern equivalent, but you can see from that big noisy image that was collected between the early 90s and the later 90s with the European ERS-1 satellite, that down in this left-hand corner of Antarctica, the black area, which is the first indication that we had the Antarctic ice sheet was losing ice and contributing to sea level rise. Again, something that's felt all over the planet. Nowadays, we can make that assessment with much more precision, even do it on a seasonal basis and year by year, see how much ice is being lost. But 1998 was our first assessment of ice sheet change. Moving forward, I'll take us straight up, bang up to date, what's going on in Antarctica at the moment. Many of the ice shelves that we started to see were changing have now retreated substantially and progressively. The shape of the Antarctic Peninsula, that rocky peninsula that points out towards South America, has changed dramatically. Not just one ice shelf that you may have read about in the newspapers, Larsen A, Larsen B, but actually 9 ice shelves have actually retreated as a result of climate change around the Antarctic Peninsula. The biggest iceberg that has come off the Antarctic Peninsula in recent years, A68, was the culmination, if you like, of that progression. What else has happened? Well, in recent times, we've been looking back to our station at Halley. Halley 1 got buried, Halley 2 got buried, and so on until we built Halley 6. And Halley 6 now stands on top of the ice sheet in a way that we can jack it up. We can also move that station, and it's a very good job we can, because that chasm marked in the middle of the ice sheet has been growing only over the last, since 2013, but it threatened at one stage to put our station onto an iceberg, so we've moved it inland. Unfortunately, the state of that ice shelf is unpredictable, and we cannot commit staff to staying at Halley Station over the winter period when it's dark and -50, and we couldn't get them out. So for the last 2 years, we've had nobody at Halley. That's a big problem, and it's a big problem for those ozone measurements. So we put in this motley crew last season, and they were to build an automatic power system that would take Halley through the winter. It was set off in January this year. It's essentially a jet engine in a box. It spins at 70,000 RPMs. And it produces 10 kilowatts of power. It was started in January the 12th, and I can announce today that we got back to Halley yesterday, and it is still spinning. It's been running unattended through the entire Antarctic winter. It's encountered temperatures of -50. It's maintained a suite of scientific instruments, and this is really the first fully automated station, wintering station in Antarctica. So my hat's off to those people. That's the infrastructure, and Halley 6 behind, being powered by the cable. That's actually Halley, and that's the latest webcam image from Halley. So it really has managed to get through an enormously difficult winter season, and it's not into the summer yet. What else is happening? Well, you'll remember that diagram that I showed you on the right-hand side here of where the Antarctic is losing ice into the ocean. We need to know why that's happening. We need to know what is driving it and how it will proceed in the future, because sea level is a global thing. We will feel, just down the river in the Thames, we will feel sea level rise that comes from Antarctica almost immediately. We need to know how much ice is being lost. At the moment, sea level's rising by about 3 millimeters per year, but by the end of the century, even mid-range estimates would suggest that sea level might well be an inch per year of rise. And this area is the key uncertainty in those projections. So we're sending teams in to really understand the impact of what's driving this system. Mostly it's not the atmosphere, it's the oceans. It's warm water getting underneath those ice shelves, thinning them and allowing them to flow more rapidly into the oceans, allowing sea level to rise. This is a UK-US program. It's a remote part of Antarctica by anybody's standards, and actually it's only with combining the UK and US logistical capability that we can get scientists into this area. This season will be one of the largest field programs ever to be conducted in Antarctica. I will be going down in December through the US station into the field to join the parties that are undertaking this field work. Our results will take a few years to come out, but our anticipation is that we're really going to help constrain the numbers around the projection of future sea level rise. So now I get onto much harder territory for a scientist who likes to talk from evidence, and I've been asked to make some predictions about the future. Some are good and some aren't so good, but let's start with what I think we know. 2050, the UK government has now committed for the UK to become carbon neutral by 2050. That will mean that many organisations are challenged to do what they do at the moment, but to do it with less power. We're just launching a new ship, the Sir David Attenborough, and if that follows its predecessor, it will be in service for something around 30 years. So by 2050, we will be looking for a replacement for the Sir David Attenborough. Perhaps it's ironic that we may end up going back to vessels that actually derive their power from wind. If sea ice around the Antarctic retreats as a function of climate change, then perhaps actually that task will be easier and we'll be able to sail to our stations rather than having to plough through the ice using an enormous amount of carbon. Further into the future, maybe 2080, this is harder to predict, but the ozone hole will, if we are adherent to the restrictions on the emissions of CFCs, will heal up. We are quite confident of that. The date is a little less certain, but certainly in the mid-2065 to 2080, we expect that ozone hole to heal and to not emerge each spring. That actually will cement the Montreal Protocol that prohibited those emissions as probably the most successful treaty that's ever been signed within the global geopolitical system. It's actually had an impact across the entire planet. That's a good news story. If we go out to 2200, I have to say that I think the outlook for Antarctica is more bleak, and that the environmental change that we've seen, the ice sheets, the ice shelves, those changes will continue. And this is my vision of what Antarctica will actually look like. We'll see an increasing loss of ice shelves. We'll see an increasing exposure of rock, certainly on the Antarctic Peninsula. That in itself may encourage alien species that hitherto have not been able to colonize Antarctica to get a toehold and then disperse through the Antarctic continent in a way that we've not seen before. The ice shelves will continue to retreat and nibble away at the edges of Antarctica, and we will see new maps drawn as the continental shelf changes. This is not the product of a fine computer model. This is my own artistic impression of what may happen. But nonetheless, we would expect all of these ice shelves to be hit by climate change by 2200. The West Antarctic ice sheet, that part of Antarctica that we're beginning to work on at the moment, Thwaites Glacier, it is entirely possible that that will be undergoing a dramatic ice sheet collapse as more warm water gets underneath the ice shelves and erodes the ice shelf, driving the point at which it starts to flow inland and uncovering new parts of the Antarctic that haven't been uncovered for, let us say, at least 400,000 years. We will expect to see sea ice retreat around the continent, exposing parts of the Antarctic Ocean that rarely get exposed at the moment, making them different habitats. We'll see changes in all of the penguins, seals, colonies that currently use Antarctic ice. And we'll see the migration of marine living resources, marine living species. Some of those currently exist up to the edge of the Antarctic in the coldest waters that exist on the planet. As those waters essentially disappear and the warmer water comes in to replace them, some of those habitats and inevitably some of those species will disappear as well. So that's my story. From the first and initial observations back in 1819 of the Antarctic South Shetland Islands, through the present and into a somewhat unknown future, where the activities that we're undertaking on the rest of the planet will have a direct impact even on that last continent. Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in again this evening, and thanks again to David, Jane and Camilla, who are available for another 15 minutes to answer your questions and respond to your comments. or should you have any other questions, do get in touch with director@rgs.org. Next week we're going to be streaming our final lecture of the Greatest Hits series, The Age of Geography, given by Nick Crane. Nick will be available to answer your questions throughout, and I look forward to welcoming you again next Monday.